There's a certain kind of thrill that comes with camping in the woods, being out in nature, away from the noise of the city. Just you, your friends, and the crackling of the campfire. We had all grown up together, my friends and I, and this was supposed to be a weekend to unwind and relive some of our childhood memories. But that trip became the stuff of nightmares, something we never talk about when we're together. It's hard to believe, but I swear every word is true. It was late October, and the air had a sharp bite to it, the kind that warns you winter is just around the corner. There were 4 of us, me, Ryan, Sarah, and Jake. We had chosen a secluded spot in the woods near a lake, far from the nearest town. The area was known for its peacefulness, and we figured it would be the perfect place to escape for a few days. We arrived late in the afternoon and set up our tents near the water's edge. The lake was still, like glass, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. Everything seemed perfect, just the way we had imagined. We spent the evening around the fire, roasting marshmallows, telling stories, and laughing like we hadn't in years. As the night wore on, the woods around us grew darker, the shadows deeper. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shapes among the trees. Sarah, who had always been a bit of a prankster, decided to tell a ghost story about the area. She claimed that decades ago, a group of campers had gone missing not far from where we were. No one ever found them, but people still reported strange things and explained noises, flickering lights, figures moving in the shadows. Ryan and Jake laughed it off, teasing Sarah for trying to scare us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, into the darkness beyond the fire's glow, half expecting to see something lurking there. Eventually, the fire burned down to embers, and we decided to call it a night. We retreated to our tents, the laughter fading into the quiet of the woods. I lay awake, staring at the roof of my tent, listening to the sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. But beneath those familiar sounds, there was something else, something faint and almost imperceptible. A soft rustling, like footsteps, moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal passing by, but my heart began to race. I was too anxious to stay in the tent, so I unzipped it quietly and stepped outside. The night was colder than before, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the campsite. As I stood there, trying to calm my nerves, I noticed something strange, a dim, flickering light in the distance, deep in the woods. It was too far away to be our campfire, which had already burned out, and it moved slowly, as if someone were walking through the trees with a lantern. I called out softly, "Ryan, Jake, Sarah." But there was no response, just the eerie silence of the forest. Curiosity and unease battled within me, but I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the light, keeping my steps quiet so as not to wake the others. As I walked deeper into the woods, the light grew brighter, but it seemed to move further away, almost like it was leading me somewhere. After what felt like hours of walking, I reached a small clearing. The light vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving me in total darkness. My flashlight flickered and then went out, leaving me stranded in the pitch-black night. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking, but it was no use, it was dead. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably real. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound. The whisper came again, closer this time, but I couldn't understand the words. It was like someone was speaking in a language I'd never heard before, their voice wet and raspy, like a breath escaping from a mouthful of water. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. As I scrambled to get up, I felt something cold brush against my arm, like fingers trailing over my skin. I yanked my arm away and ran, not caring which direction I was heading. just desperate to get away from whatever was in that clearing. The trees closed in around me, the branches clawing at my clothes and face as I tore through the woods. I could still hear the whispers, growing louder, more insistent, as if they were all around me. Panic seized me, and I ran blindly, not knowing if I was getting closer to camp or further away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the trees and into our campsite. I was panting, my body trembling with fear. The tents were still there, the lake calm and undisturbed, but something felt off. The camp was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and unnatural. I rushed to Ryan's tent and unzipped it, but he wasn't inside. Neither was Jake or Sarah. Their tents were empty, their sleeping bags neatly laid out as if they had never been touched. I called out their names, my voice cracking, but there was no answer, just that same oppressive silence. I grabbed my phone from my tent and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen flickered, and then the battery drained to zero, leaving me in the dark once more. I was completely alone. I sat by the cold remains of our campfire, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid to close my eyes. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up what I could and left, leaving the tents and everything else behind. I never found out what happened to Ryan, Sarah, and Jake. The authorities searched the area for days, but there was no trace of them. It was as if they had simply vanished, just like the campers in Sarah's story. I've tried to put that night behind me, but it still haunts me. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear those whispers, feel the cold fingers on my arm. Whatever was out there in the woods, it took my friends, and I know it could have taken me too. I don't go camping anymore, and I never will again. The woods may seem peaceful and inviting, but they hide secrets that are better left undisturbed. Camping has always been a cherished tradition in my family. My dad loved taking us out to the woods, where we'd pitch a tent under the stars and tell stories around the campfire. When he passed away last year, I decided to honor his memory by taking a solo camping trip to one of our favorite spots, a secluded area deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a way to reconnect with his spirit, to feel close to him again. But what I encountered out there made me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness and the boundaries between the living and the dead. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The place hadn't changed at all. It was still as isolated and quiet as I remembered. I parked my car, grabbed my gear, and set up camp near the edge of a small clearing. The familiarity of the surroundings brought a sense of comfort, even as the woods grew darker around me. After I had everything set up, I built a fire and cooked a simple dinner, the smell of sizzling sausages and the crackle of the flames filling the air. The night was eerily still, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As I sat by the fire, I could almost imagine my dad sitting across from me, his face lit by the glow, telling one of his famous ghost stories. It was just past midnight when the first strange thing happened. I was lying in my tent, trying to sleep, when I heard a faint noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something was knocking against the side of my tent. I sat up, my heart racing. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. My flashlight was within reach, so I grabbed it and unzipped the tent flap. Shining the light into the darkness, nothing. The trees stood still, the clearing empty, but the tapping had stopped as soon as I opened the tent. I stepped outside, the cool air prickling my skin. I scanned the area with the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but saw no sign of anything that could have made the noise. Just the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the crackling of the dying fire, shaking off the unease. I crawled back into the tent and tried to convince myself it was just a branch knocking against the fabric. But deep down, I knew better. The tapping had been too precise, too deliberate. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Sometime later, I drifted off, but I was soon jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, coming from just outside the tent. Someone or something was circling my camp. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the tent. The fabric shifted slightly as if something was brushing against it, and then the tapping resumed, louder this time, insistent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to stay silent, to stay still. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped, and the footsteps retreated into the woods, fading into the distance. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any sign of movement, but the forest had fallen eerily silent once again. I knew I wasn't going to sleep again that night. I sat up, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline, every nerve on edge. The hours dragged by, each minute stretching into an eternity as I waited for the dawn to break. When the first light of morning finally filtered through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The sense of unease that had settled over me during the night hadn't lifted. If anything, it had only grown stronger. As I was packing up, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The ground around my tent was disturbed, the leaves scattered and trampled as if someone had walked in circles around it all night. And then I saw the footprints. They were human, or at least they looked like it, but there was something off about them. They were too large, the toes elongated and twisted, almost claw-like. I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. I wasn't alone out there, and whatever had been stalking me wasn't human. I finished packing up and threw my gear into the car, my hands shaking. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing after me. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me until I was miles away from the campsite, back on the main road. When I finally got home, I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had let the isolation and darkness play tricks on me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home, something that had been waiting in those woods for years. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the tapping, the slow, deliberate footsteps circling my tent, and the eerie silence that followed. I wanted to connect with my dad's spirit, to find peace in the place we had loved so much. Instead, I found something else, something that still lingers in the shadows of my mind, a reminder that some places should be left undisturbed. We had all been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. A group of four close friends. We needed the break after a stressful semester at college. The plan was simple: spend a weekend in the woods, away from the pressures of classes and the noise of the city. Just us, a few tents, and the tranquility of nature. The spot we chose was deep in the woods, far from any towns or main roads. Jason had found it on some obscure hiking forum, a place so secluded that it was described as untouched. That idea appealed to all of us. The remoteness was exciting, a chance to disconnect completely and enjoy each other's company without distractions. We arrived early Friday afternoon. The drive had been long, the roads narrowing as we left civilization behind, finally turning onto a dirt path that led us deep into the forest. The campsite was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a crystal-clear lake nearby. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. We set up our tents, built a fire pit, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. There was a sense of freedom in being so far from everything, and we were all in high spirits. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird call. It felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves. As the sun began to set, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees. We laughed, joked, and enjoyed the kind of easy camaraderie that only close friends share. But, as the night deepened, an odd feeling started to creep in, a sense that we were being watched. It began with small things, a rustling in the bushes that we dismissed as an animal, the sudden chill that made us huddle closer to the fire, the way the wind seemed to carry whispers we couldn't quite make out. I brushed it off, figuring it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But, as the night wore on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, the sounds of the forest all around me. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in a steady rhythm. I lay there, listening, trying to let the sounds lull me to sleep, but something felt off. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down on you, making your skin crawl. I was drifting in and out of sleep when I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something knocking against the side of my tent. My heart jumped into my throat. I strained to listen, my breath catching in my chest. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was deliberately trying to get my attention. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking. When I turned it on, the beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the fabric of the tent, fluttering slightly in the wind. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just a branch or an animal brushing against the tent. But then I heard it again, this time from the other side, and it was unmistakable. Someone was outside. Sophie, Liam, Emily. I called out softly, but there was no answer, just the tapping, continuing in its unsettling rhythm. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the tent and shone the flashlight outside. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, and the beam of light revealed nothing. The campsite was empty, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I swept the light across the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. The others were still in their tents, or so I thought. I was about to crawl back inside when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat. It was tall, unnaturally so, and seemed to blend with the shadows. I couldn't make out any features, just the vague outline of a human shape. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady, but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. Panic set in, and I stumbled back into my tent, zipping it up quickly. I could still feel its presence, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me. I wanted to call out to my friends, to wake them up, but fear kept me silent. What if it wasn't just one figure? What if there were more, surrounding us? Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I sat there, huddled in my sleeping bag, flashlight clutched in my hand. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and bolted toward Jason's tent. I practically tore the flap open and shook him awake. "There's someone out there," I whispered urgently. Jason gradually blinked at me, then looked outside. "Where?" I pointed to where I had seen the figure, but it was gone. The clearing was empty, as if nothing had ever been there. My heart was still pounding, my skin crawling with the memory of that dark shape. "You probably just imagined it," Jason said, though I could tell he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "It's late. The mind plays tricks." We decided not to wake the others. Jason sat up with me for a while, but nothing else happened. The forest was as silent as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep in Jason's tent, but my dreams were filled with dark figures lurking just beyond the firelight, watching, waiting. The next morning, I expected the night's events to feel distant, like a bad dream, but the unease lingered. The others noticed it too, an oppressive feeling that settled over us like a heavy fog. We packed up quickly, eager to leave, and by midday, we were back in the car, the safety of the road a welcome sight. None of us spoke much on the drive home. I think we were all trying to process what had happened, or didn't happen. To this day, we never really talked about it, but I know what I saw that night. And I know it wasn't just my imagination. I haven't been camping since.